And we're live.
So, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being with us on this historic day. I'm just so excited to be joined this morning by incredible leaders from across Massachusetts who have spent their lives and their careers fighting for equity, fighting for justice, and fighting for true liberation. And I'm honored to welcome the distinguished president of the NAACP Boston chapter, Tanisha Sullivan, the outstanding director of the Racial Justice Program at ACLU, Massachusetts, San Hall, and the extraordinary cultural proficiency coach at Pittsfield Public Schools, Shirley Edgerton. Yesterday, I had the privilege of joining President Biden, Vice President Harris, and my colleagues from the Senate and the House in the signing of our legislation into law to establish Juneteenth as a federal holiday. I was proud to be the lead author of this bill in the United States Senate. We cannot begin to express our profound thanks to the activists and leaders who made this holiday a reality. A special thanks, though, to Ms. Opal Lee from Texas, the grandmother and the North Star of this movement. She is one of those special people who comes along and changes the rhyme and rhythm of our national history. She is an inspiration and a godsend to our nation, and she inspired me from the day I met her and introduced the legislation until yesterday afternoon in the White House. Opal Lee is just a political gem, an incredible leader, and she's now changed our country. Yesterday was a momentous day in United States history, a step forward for racial equality and a clarion call for us to continue our fight for true racial justice. The celebration of Juneteenth dates back to June 19th, 1865, when Union soldiers led by Major General Gordon Granger traveled to Galveston, Texas, with the announcement that the Civil War had ended and that the enslaved were now free. This was 2.5 years after the date of President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. But either the news of Lincoln's order had not yet reached many, including those in Texas, or local officials refused to enforce it. For 150 years, communities of color have celebrated Juneteenth in parades, festivals, and flag raisings across the country. Massachusetts was home to the first Juneteenth flag in the year 2000. But today, for the first time, we will celebrate Juneteenth as a federal holiday. We celebrate an overdue acknowledgement of our nation's original sin, that discrimination was a serpent coiled into the Constitution of the United States. We celebrate Black Americans receiving the remembrance, recognition, and honor they are owed. We now will give formal commemoration to this day of celebration, liberation, and hope. And as a result of this day, education across the country will occur about what happened in our nation, the progress that has been made, but how much more needs to be done to achieve true racial justice. This holiday is just one important step forward in our fight for true racial justice, and we have a long road ahead. Now it's up to us to fight for substantive police accountability and pass the George Floyd Policing Act so that we end the horrific cycle of police brutality and murder by some law enforcement officials. It is time to pass real voting rights reform so that every person across our country, regardless of the color of their skin, is able to make their voice heard and count in our electoral system. We're going to have an historic vote on the floor of the United States Senate next week on voting rights in our country. It is time to ensure economic health and environmental justice for communities of color across this country, to put an end to shameful disparities that have existed and persisted for all too long. And it's time to acknowledge our wrongs and repair the harm done to generations of African Americans by providing them with long overdue reparations. So while tomorrow is a day of renewal, on Sunday, our fight begins anew. Even today, as conservatives try to erase history with their attacks on critical race theory and teaching our children about the presence of systemic racism, we stand together, acknowledging the truth. Even as a Republican obstructionist agenda threatens to block our progress on voting rights, police reform, and reparations, we will not stop fighting to abolish the filibuster and ensure long overdue justice in our country. We must center justice in everything that we do. Creating this federal holiday is just one step in our nation's ongoing journey towards racial justice and liberation. Let's keep working together tirelessly for racial justice so that children will have to turn to the history books to learn there ever was discrimination and inequality in America. We still have a long journey ahead of us. And I'm honored to be joined by the advocates and fighters who are leading the way here in Massachusetts. And I'd like to begin now by introducing my good friend, Tanisha Sullivan, the president of the Boston NAACP.
Thank you, Senator Markey. Good morning to everyone. Senator Markey, thank you for the opportunity to be here with you this morning in celebration. And also thank you for, of course, your leadership on this important piece of legislation. I do want to, of course, acknowledge, as you did, Ms. Opal Lee, the grandmother of this particular movement. What a day it is for her and for so many who have fought for this day to become a reality. This is our Freedom Day. For those of us in the Black community, we have celebrated this day for over 155 years. It is a day of celebration. It's a day of commemoration. In fact, in the NAACP Boston branch, our mantra is freedom is our mission. This is a time to embrace joy and to embrace hope. But it is also an important marker in our fight for equality and our work to create a more perfect union where the promise of America is a reality for us all. We are certainly not there yet, and we acknowledge that there will be many roads, many paths that will lead us to our goal. But by lifting up Juneteenth as a national holiday, we help to expand the space for greater knowledge and understanding of our nation's history, all of it, including the scourge of slavery and the systemic racism that supported its existence. Again, Black joy is a real thing. And for those of us in the Black community who have celebrated Juneteenth for generations, we will continue to do so, welcoming others into this celebration. But it should never be forgotten that our joy in the Black community is fuel for our fight. So as the nation celebrates with us this weekend, we also ask that our nation fights with us to eradicate the vestiges of slavery that still exist in this country. Fight with us to ensure that American history is told in truth in pursuit of reconciliation and forward progress. Fight with us to secure our democracy and to protect voting rights through the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Fight with us for housing, economic, and educational justice. Fight with us, as Senator Markey said, for reparations to repair the harm that has been done and continues to be done through the legacy and experience of slavery. We ask that you fight with us in our quest for freedom and our pursuit for the American promise for all of us. Thank you, and I look forward to our conversation today. You're on mute, Senator Markey.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for those beautiful words. And now I'd like to introduce Rasan Hall, the Director of the Racial Justice Program at ACLU, Massachusetts. Welcome.
Thank you, Senator Markey, for the invitation to participate in this important conversation, but also for your leadership on this very important initiative to recognize this particularly significant moment in our nation's history, not only because it is an acknowledgement of emancipation of all previously enslaved individuals, well after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, but also as an acknowledgement of the struggle of Black people in America to have some semblance of freedom. And despite the oppression that we have consistently faced in every venue and aspect of our lives, there has been this resilience and determination, as Tanisha talked about, this Black joy, to not have our joy stifled, to not have our accomplishments undermined, to not have the truth of our history denied. And so the significance of enacting this day as a federal holiday is a step towards the justice that so many who have come before us, so many of our ancestors, could not have envisioned. That said, the amount of work that still lie ahead may be seemingly insurmountable, but the grit and determination, valor that has been shown, particularly by people in the African American community, is the inspiration and encouragement that we will continue to need to really truly see freedom for all. I was just reflecting this morning as a young boy growing up in Denver, Colorado, where Juneteenth celebrations were a regular occurrence. Being down in the 5 Point section of Denver, seeing the parades and the promenades and eating the food and seeing the celebration, experiencing that joyous moment for recognition where liberation and freedom was granted. And so I could have never imagined as a child, knowing then even the burdens and atrocities and injustices Black people in this country faced, that we would be at a moment where this type of, where this would become a federal holiday. I would be remiss if I were not to point out the hypocrisy that there can be a unanimous vote for making this a federal holiday, yet there can't be enough votes for the People Act to bring about sweeping voting rights reforms and protections. That there can be a unanimous vote for the recognition of a holiday, but not enough votes for the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. That there can be a unanimous vote to recognize this holiday, but there's consternation about whether or not DC should be a state, or that there should be conversations or commissions to study reparations. Some of the very people who cast a vote in favor of this holiday are some of the very people who stand in opposition to teachers being able to explain what this holiday even means and why it is significant. So Senator Markey, thank you for your leadership and your vision, and for listening to the people who said this should happen, and looking forward to the continued conversation, but more importantly, the continued work.
Thank you, Rasan, so much. Thank you for all of your great work. And now I'd like to welcome our third exemplary panelist, Shirley Edgerton, the Cultural Proficiency Coach at Pittsfield Public Schools. Welcome, Shirley.
Okay. Good morning, and thank you, Senator. I'm honored to be here this morning with my esteemed colleagues who are doing a tremendous work in the Commonwealth, and our senator who has been a dynamo on behalf of justice. So I'm also honored this morning, like others, to recognize Opal Lee, the 94 years old activist from Fort Worth, Texas, who, as has been stated, is known as the grandmother of Juneteenth, and our Senator Markey and other members of Congress in making Ms. Dream's Ms. Lee's dream become a reality, and President Biden for signing this historic legislation. I view the federal celebration of Juneteenth as a significant opportunity to celebrate, educate, and bring awareness to the systemic inequities that exist in the fabric of our nation. We can celebrate our freedom and continue to right the historic wrongs in housing, education, the justice system, and more. On Saturday, as we celebrate Juneteenth Day in Pittsfield, the women of Coven Given Circle, a philanthropic organization dedicated to enhancing the lives of girls and women of color through education, and the Berkshire branch of the NAACP will present scholarships to over 25 2021 African American high school graduates as they pursue their goals of higher education. I want to bring hope and encourage them to be resilient as our ancestors. My greatest hope is this pivotal moment of recognizing the brutality and end of slavery, that America will begin to systematically pay its debt, and that payment or reparations will include an opportunity for all African American students to walk the halls of higher learning without being saddled with debt. I'm jubilant and hopeful that if the numbers swell and we continue to call for collective action loudly and compellingly and individual accountability, we can move the arc of justice and truly celebrate freedom for all. Thank you, Senator Markey.
Let me ask the first question, if I may. What impact, in your opinion, does Juneteenth make in terms of becoming a federal holiday? What is the difference that you now think has occurred because of that bill signing yesterday and the federal recognition of this event in Texas on June 19th, 1865?
Well, Senator, I think, the bill signing is an important marker in this work. But in terms of the impact is yet to be seen, and it quite frankly is up to us. I think that the declaration of the federal holiday does kind of open up the space for, again, more learning and more understanding. But the holiday alone is not going to do it. As you articulated, I mean, we still need to have a real meaningful, deep conversation about the history and legacy of slavery in this country and its ongoing impact. And, HR 40 would help to get us there, right? Having a commission to study reparations and to help really lay the groundwork for what repair for the harm of slavery can and should look like in this country. So I do believe that there's more to be done, but certainly appreciative of this particular marker. To Rasan's point, earlier, it is important to note that this is one of the few pieces of legislation that has made it through the Senate, sir, and has made it through the Senate, unanimously. Yet and still, the legislation that can truly help to drive impact today for communities of color, and specifically the Black community, to address systemic racism are stuck. And so it is my hope that in Congress, we will see, again, John Lewis Voting Rights Act move forward. We need to secure voting rights and access in this country, that the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act will be able to pass, but also I do want to acknowledge that here in the Commonwealth, we have a lot of work to do as well. And so it is my hope that, again, as we celebrate this weekend, that there's a double downing of a commitment to the fight for true racial justice and equality.
And I also, to add to the initial response, which pretty much covered a lot of the issues and concerns in the African American community, I'm hoping that this symbol of celebration of the end of slavery will help to create an opportunity for others to become much more aware that there's a deeper level of education, that there's some self-reflection, and that that Americans will begin to own the fact of, as you said, Senator, the original sin. That there will be some taking of responsibility. So the legislation that Tanisha and Rashad just spoke of, that there will be a much more gathering of the people to decide that there's a real need for change in our country. So I'm hopeful because I think that anything that moves us towards the mark can make a difference in the inequities that exist in the Commonwealth and throughout our country.
So thank you.
If I could just add.
Rashawn,
Go ahead.
you spoke, Rashawn, about voting rights. Next week, we're going to have a showdown on the floor of the United States Senate. That could be a major step on this road to racial justice in our country if we had true voting reform. Can you talk about that and how important this moment is?
It's eminently important. I think when we look at the turnout in the last election, despite the fact that we were beset by a global pandemic, we saw numbers that we haven't really seen before. And that is because access and opportunity to the ballot were expanded. Many states made sure that individuals were able to vote by mail, that there were secure drop boxes available, that there were early voting locations and extended early voting days throughout the country. And as a result, we saw massive turnout. And now we are seeing the pendulum swinging back, particularly in conservative state legislatures. It's highly problematic what we've seen, because the very initiatives that are being pursued, like the elimination of early voting days, proposing a punishment for people who are helping individuals who are in line waiting to vote, are clearly targeted towards Black voters and voters of color. The disproportionate impact of these reforms shows a clear correlation. There's even been studies to show the correlation between where there's been increased Black voter turnout and the onset of these regressive reforms. And so this is a very serious fight that is ahead. Since 2013, the Supreme Court decision Shelby v. Holder, which gutted the pre-clearance requirements of the Voting Rights Act, because many of the states where we're seeing these types of regressive reforms being introduced, or regressive anti-voting laws, we'll call them, being introduced, are states that were previously covered jurisdictions, so they would have had to receive approval. When we think about the essence of this country, this nation, and our democracy, our representative democracy, what is essential, what the essential piece of it is voting rights. It is the preservative of all rights. And when that is hampered and infringed upon, it's going to disproportionately impact historically marginalized groups, and it's going to impact the trajectory of our nation. And so as we celebrate this moment of looking at the granting of freedom and liberty for formerly enslaved individuals, we cannot repeat the cycle of oppression, and need to have a pro-freedom agenda. And hopefully you all are victorious as that debate happens?
Well, we're in for a huge battle. On Wednesday, 2 days ago, we invited the leaders of the Texas state legislature, House and Senate, in to talk to the 50 Democratic senators in Washington. And they were African American and Latino. And they laid out what this plan is that Governor Abbott has in Texas in terms of the suppression of the vote and the impact that it would have upon redistricting, additional representation for minority communities in Texas. And it was an incredible moment for us to hear the 5 of them go through in detail what is being planned in Texas, even as we celebrate Juneteenth, in Galveston, where the word finally reached that slavery had been abolished. And then yesterday, Senator Raphael Warnock, Reverend Warnock from Georgia, the new senator elected in a special election on January 5th of this year, he got up to address us and tell us what is happening in Georgia. And we know what they're trying to do in Georgia. It's to suppress the vote because he has to run again next year in 2022. And there is a plan there in place as well to make it much more difficult to ensure that all voters have easy access to vote. And we know what the plan is. It is ultimately to reduce the participation of the poorest, of the communities of color all across our country. So could you speak to that, Tanisha, in terms of where we are and what this moment really represents, given what we're seeing in red states all across the country in the introduction of new voting rights restrictions?
Absolutely. You lifted up both Texas and Georgia, but as we know, these efforts are happening in well over 45 states across the country, and it is no accident. It is a targeted effort to suppress the vote of historically marginalized communities, the Black community, other communities of color, low income communities, and it is a direct response to the overwhelming participation in our democracy that we saw last year. This is the fight. This is the fight in America, truly, for our democracy. And for those of us who are deeply committed to the work of racial justice and equality, we understand the importance of this moment. This is not a new fight. Certainly, the enfranchisement, the right for the vote, has been one that has been well fought by people of color, by women, for generations. But I also think it's important in this moment to understand that this is not just about racial justice. This is even bigger than that. And understanding that if we don't have a strong democracy, then our nation cannot move forward. Our nation is not strong. We are currently among nations that have been described as a flawed democracy. The United States of America being designated as a flawed democracy among other nations, global nations, that should rock us to our core. And it is well within our power as a nation to determine that our value of democracy, our value of free and fair access to the ballot box is one that we will not allow to be destroyed. And so regardless of whether we're talking about Republicans or Democrats or independents or Green, it doesn't matter the party. This is now about our country. And so it is incumbent upon, truly incumbent upon Congress to do what needs to be done to pass meaningful voting rights legislation. We know that Senator Manchin has placed on the table an alternative plan. Most important is that we are protecting and preserving the right to access the ballot box, and that we are doing all that we can to beat back any attempt to restrict voting rights in an effort to limit the access for any demographic group. And so I am hopeful that, my focus is on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, because, those pre-clearance provisions, I do believe are critically important. And if they were in effect today, we might not be seeing what we're seeing across the country. And so I am very hopeful that Senator Markey, you and your colleagues will get this one done in very short order.
Yeah, thank you. And what we heard from Texas was frightening. These legislators had the courage to walk out, just not participate in a fraudulent legislative procedure. And what we heard from them was, over the last 10 years, 80% of the population growth in Texas has been African-American and Latino. And Governor Abbott and the Republicans have no intention of adding any new congressional seats or state Senate or state House of Representative seats for minority representation. That's where we are. I mean, this is really a crisis of democracy that we're in. Shirley, would you like to add your comments on this moment?
Well, I can only agree with what has already been stated, and emphasize that once again we're at a moment where in history where we can really make a difference, where we can be going in the books of history as a people that did the right thing regardless of the backlash. We know that that's the history of America. Even though we are talking about the celebration of the end of enslavement, the reality is that there has been a continuation of different forms of enslavement that have impacted African Americans. So, we've had a Black president. We have, just like Reconstruction, the Black senators, and currently have Black senators. So we've made some major and significant successes, but the reality is that there's still a lot of inequities. There's still the achievement gaps academically, the wealth gaps, the issues of housing, and all of these things just are very basic to our lives. And so I think it's again a significant time, and it's an opportunity for us to double down and work even harder to move us forward, and particularly in voting. I encourage young people every day to have a sense of responsibility to vote, regardless of what the obstacles are, regardless to the lies that we hear in the media, regardless to the contrary lessons that they may hear, but that they just need to look at the history of who we are as a people, the resilience that's there, our continuous zeal to truly be free and live lives just like other groups. We're not asking for anything different. We're just asking for equal playing ground, so we can have the same opportunities, so our children will be able to pursue all that they choose to pursue. So it's not a conversation 10, 20 years from now about the first Black. As we look at our current president and all of the firsts that have occurred with our former President Barack Obama, the same thing, the first. So we have to encourage voting. We have to continue to fight, because that makes the difference to equity and opportunity in our country.
thank you. Let me ask one final question, if I could, then we'll go to questions from the press. To each of you, what is the true meaning of Black liberation? What do you think that goal should be? Rasan, could you take that and just give us your reflections on Juneteenth?
Sure. Black liberation in earnest is an experience of freedom and an experience of being in this country unencumbered by structural racism and white supremacy. It's about being allowed to be great and not having to be great in spite of, not having to succeed in spite of. But being in a world that where harm is not perpetuated by the institutions that we look to provide for us and to establish structure within society. That true liberation, we certainly have it as a people, spiritually, culturally, but now we need to have it politically, economically, and physically, being free from systems of harm and oppression. And I think we can achieve that. I think the abolitionist movement is casting a vision of a world that exists without these systems of oppression and harm. And the more we tack in line with the vision that is being cast by dynamic young people, but also our ancestors and scholars and leaders of the past, the better we will be and the closer we will be to that true liberation.
Thank you, Rasan. Tanisha.
Freedom is our mission. Freedom is joy. Freedom is hope. Freedom is the ability to live life unencumbered, and specifically here in the United States, freedom is embodied when we are able to truly participate in the promise of America, that we are truly able to benefit from all of the prosperity that our country has to offer, all of the opportunities that our country has to offer, not bound by systemic racism, not bound by sexism, not bound by homophobia or any other isms that we are fighting against here in this nation. When I think of freedom, Senator, my face lights up because I believe it's possible. As Rasan said, as a woman of faith, I am free. But as a Black woman walking this earth, I understand that there are shackles that have yet to be broken. And so my hope is that one day we will, regardless of who we are, regardless of how we came here, that we will be able to experience true freedom and liberation in this country.
Thank you, Tanisha. And Shirley.
I think liberation is the ability for our young people to dream and to know that all is possible, that they could reach their fullest potential. I think that liberty is not deferring their dreams, as Langston Hughes so eloquently put it, but that to understand that all that exists in this magnificent country is theirs, that there's no partiality, that there's equity, that there's opportunity for all. All you need to do is to dream and to reach. So that's liberty to me. I just, to be able to totally, in every aspect of our being, experience the wonderment that exists in this country. We're very fortunate people, but some of us have not experienced all that there is to experience and to live. So being able to have fresh air, the environmental issues, it's being able, education is a major piece for me and a major banner. It's all of our young people, regardless of their abilities, being able to engage in equitable education. All of our young people, not some. Doesn't matter on what the label is in terms of their abilities. It's all. It's our young men, like my son, being able to travel in the evening and mothers not worry about their well-being. It's all of that is about liberty and freedom. The things that many don't even have to think about. But those of us of color, we think about those things constantly. That impacts on our well-being. The research again is there that talks about the stress and the anxiety for African Americans and other people of color and other groups that are oppressed in our country. So for me, that's liberty and that's freedom. And that's why I'm glad that that federal legislation passed.
Thank you, Shirley, and thank you, and thanks to all of you for your eloquence and for your passionate leadership from Massachusetts, but for the whole country. Thank you so much for this incredible conversation today. And Taylor, I don't know if we can make it possible for any members of the press to ask questions of our great panel.
Any questions? All righty. I think you're good to wrap it up, Senator.
So thank you all so much for joining us today. We have much more work to do. We've heard of all of the issues that are still on the table. In my opinion, if we are going to have real, true police reform in our country, we have to repeal the filibuster. If we're going to have environmental justice in our country, we have to repeal the filibuster. If we're going to have true healthcare equality in our country, we have to repeal the filibuster. If we're going to have true voting rights reform in our country, we need to repeal the filibuster. We're coming to a historic political showdown in our country, but we know what the agenda has to be. If we are going to know true justice, we are going to have to change the way in which the United States Senate operates. And the leaders who have joined us today have given us the roadmap to the future. I can't thank all of them enough for all of the great work which you do. Thank you all so much for joining us today.